What are some events in recorded history that are extremely hard to believe, but without a doubt actually happened? There was a Japanese man called Tsutomu Yamaguchi who was on his way to work in Hiroshima in 1945, when he saw falling through the sky, 2 miles from where he stood, what ultimately turned out to be the atomic bomb. He had just enough time to take cover in a ditch as the bomb detonated, and miraculously he survived. Somehow the Hiroshima train station was still operational, and so Yamaguchi, battered, bombed and bruised, decided to board a train to his family home so he could recover in Nagasaki. 3 days later Yamaguchi was called into work to explain what he saw, which he did. At work, as he began to tell the story of what happened, the second bomb dropped. It was the reinforced concrete walls around him that saved him this time, and Yamaguchi quickly ran to find his wife and son. Ground temperatures in the city reached 4,000 degrees Celsius and radioactive rain poured down. The family's home was destroyed. But Yamaguchi's wife and son had thankfully been out shopping looking for burn ointment for Yamaguchi when the bomb fell, and they'd survived. Despite this ordeal of having survived 2 nuclear explosions and subsequent radiation exposure, Yamaguchi went on to live till 93 years of age. He died in 2010 after being recognized by the Japanese government as a Niju Hibakusha, or twice-bombed person. In 1908 Russia showed up 12 days late to the Olympics because the world switched calendars while they did not. Michael Malloy aka Mike the Durable aka Iron Mike. During the Great Depression, 5 men took out a life insurance policy on a homeless alcoholic that they were sure was going to drink himself to death. The owner of a bar allowed him to drink for free, but he kept drinking and didn't die. So they tried to poison him with antifreeze. Didn't work. The turpentine, horse liniment, rat poison, methanol. Still didn't work. A sandwich made with rotten sardines and tacks. Still no luck. Then they took his drunk body out in the cold and poured water on him. He lived. Then they ran him over with a car. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks, but survived. Then they poisoned him with carbon monoxide, and he finally died. They were all convicted of murder. The Irish potato famine, 1845–1849, was a huge catastrophe that resulted in 1 million dying from starvation and 1 million leaving their homeland, mostly for North America. It's really hard to put into words how scarring this famine was for so many Irish people, and the suffering was tremendous. The psychological scars still impact Ireland's psyche today. It almost sounds like a fairy tale to hear how a sultan from a faraway land heard of this tragedy and went out of his way to send ships crammed with food and medicine to the Irish people dying from hunger and disease. When Ottoman Sultan Abdulmejid heard of the suffering from his Irish dentist, he felt great compassion and sorrow for the plight of the Irish. The Sultan originally wanted to donate £10,000 to the starving populace, but British diplomats were aghast to hear this because Queen Victoria had donated a small sum of £2,000. The British government refused to accept the large donation, so he only donated a measly sum of £1,000, but he secretly sent 5 ships loaded with food. As you can imagine, the British government wasn't happy to hear of this, and the Navy attempted a blockade to stop the aid from arriving. The ships made it through the lines and arrived at Drogheda, Ireland, where they dispersed the food. The people of Drogheda were so thankful that they had the Islamic and Ottoman symbols added to their city's coat of arms. It really does read like a fairy tale and is a gesture of great empathy. It's easy to imagine how happy the starving people were to see those Turkish ships arriving with food. According to James Hack Tuke, people were living, or rather starving, upon turnip tops, sand eels and seaweed, a diet which no one in England would consider fit for the meanest animal. But the story does not end there. During the Crimean War, Britain joined the Ottoman Empire in their fight against the expanding Russian Empire. About 30,000 Irish soldiers served in the war, and it was noticed that the Irish people served enthusiastically in defense of the Sultan who had helped them during their greatest times of need. This highest form of compassion was even remembered during the First World War. It was reported that British officers complained that the Irish lacked the will to fight against the Ottomans, who remembered stories of the Ottoman Empire helping during a famine when no one else would. Sultan Abdulmejid is a model of faith in humanity being restored. Nicholas Alcemade fell 18,000 feet without a parachute from a burning plane in 1944 and suffered no serious injury. I see how the snow cover helped, but how he didn't get skewered by pine trees or break a single bone is shocking. Imagine what he was thinking when he got up from that fall. What kind of crazy thoughts were running through his head? Yeah, no one is gonna believe this one. Whoa, am I immortal? I'm fucking invincible. If you are ever in that situation, dense pine trees are about the best thing you can hope. Only thing better is dense pine trees in an area with fresh, powder snow. Trees' branches typically are thinnest at the top, and every branch you hit on the way down transfers your momentum in increments. Typically you'll still die. And double, typically you'll at least break your legs. And triple, typically you would still succumb to your wounds in the wilderness before rescue. On second thought, aim for the pavement. Juliana Kopka did the same at 17 years of age. She became famous at the age of 17 as the sole survivor of the 1971 Lanza Flight 508 plane crash. After falling 3,000 m, 10,000 ft, while strapped to her seat and suffering numerous injuries, she survived 11 days alone in the Amazon rainforest until local fishermen rescued her. That time everyone died of a dancing sickness where they danced themselves to death in France. Mass hysteria. John O'Neill, the FBI agent in charge of investigating al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in the 1990s, grew frustrated with the bureaucratic politics within the FBI and between the FBI and CIA that he felt hampered his mission. He decided to leave the FBI and take a higher-paying job in the private sector. In August 23, 2001 he became the chief of security at the World Trade Center. He was killed in the attacks just a few weeks later. My colleague was on the plane to Hawaii where the entire top of the plane ripped off. They flew the rest of the way without any overhead. Landed and everyone walked off. Absolutely insane to see the pictures. Talk about being given a second chance. John the Blind, King of Bohemia, insisted on fighting in battle and had his aides tie their horses together so they were not separated. He asked to be taken to where the battle was the loudest. The next day they were all found dead with their horses still tied together. He didn't have AIDS that we know of, but AIDS. I still find it totally insane that we were able to put men on the moon with the technology of the time. It blows my mind. Probably the greatest of all human achievement. Edwin Booth, brother of John Wilkes Booth, saved the life of Robert, the son of President Abraham Lincoln. Halley's Comet appeared in the sky when Mark Twain was born in 1835. The comet moves in a 75 or 76-year orbit, and, as it neared Earth once again, Twain said, "I came in with Halley's Comet and I expect to go out with it." Sure enough, he died on April 21, 1910, just as the comet made its next pass within sight of Earth. The Battle of Bull Run, one of the first battles of the U.S. Civil War, occurred on and around Wilmer McLean's farm in Northern Virginia. Not wanting to live surrounded by war, McLean and his family moved to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The Battle of Appomattox Courthouse was the last significant battle between Union and Confederate forces. The Confederates signed the surrender order in Wilmer's sitting room. It is said that the Civil War started on Wilmer's farm and ended in his sitting room. When the pyramids were being built, woolly mammoths still existed. The last use of the guillotine in France was the same year Star Wars was founded. 1816, the year without summer. Theodore Roosevelt found his boat was stolen. So he built a new boat, tracked the thieves down and arrested them. He then proceeded to walk them multiple days, without sleeping, so they could receive a trial instead of just shooting them on the spot. It was in the middle of a harsh winter, so he didn't handcuff them, for fear they'd get frostbite. So instead he just kept himself awake by reading Tolstoy with a gun trained on them the whole trek. Palm trees, among other flora, were present in Antarctica during the early Eocene epoch, between 55 and 48 million years ago. Christmas Day 1914. The truce on the WW1 battlefields. Shows the humanity inside everyone, but they were able to wake up the next day and go straight back to war. Kill the men that they'd spent a sincere day with. The time Indiana tried to legislate the value of Pi Link. In 1903, The New York Times published an article about flying machines. They stated that it would take the combined efforts of all mathematicians and mechanics 1 to 10 million years for powered flight to be achieved. Anyway, about 9 weeks later, the Wright brothers achieved powered flight for the first time. Here is the article. They were also overly cynical afterwards. In 1910 they said that flight would only ever be for billionaires. Of course we had commercial flights by around the 60s achievable for many. In 2019 a convicted murderer on day release bravely fought off a terrorist at London Bridge with a narwhal tusk. Link edited to add that he was a convicted murderer thanks to R. Rainbow Warrior here for reminding me. Edited again to add that the guy with the narwhal tusk was a civil servant and the convict on day release battled the terrorist with a fire extinguisher. This story gets more awesome with every correction. On 24 June 2023, the most important Russian mercenary group marched on Moscow, just to give up a few hours later. In 2014, Pope Francis released doves in the Vatican to symbolize his hopes for peace in the world. As soon as the doves began to fly, a seagull and a crow swooped down and attacked them in front of everyone. Link. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 that took place in Boston, MA. 40-foot wave that killed 21 people. Elevator operator Betty Lou Oliver survived a fall of 75 stories while in an elevator in 1945. A U.S. President Roosevelt issued an executive order that made it illegal for U.S. citizens to keep U.S. gold coins. They made everyone return them or be subject to imprisonment and large fine. The government confiscated over 2,600 metric tons. Link. I've read that when people find buried gold in the U.S. it's usually from people hiding it during this time. No idea if that's true though. The Nutmeg Wars. The Dutch and the English went to war 3 times over nutmeg, which at the time was only known to grow on one South Pacific island. Edit. For those questioning the validity of the claims made herein, and questioning whether or not they were exaggerated by the victors, they weren't. The 2 main chroniclers of the First Crusade were the Arab Muslims and Greek Byzantines, both of whom hated the Crusaders to such a degree that the latter actually wanted the Muslims to retake the Holy Land because the Western Europeans were so barbaric in comparison. In fact, some of the Muslims were so blindsided by how effective the Crusaders were, that they believed they were being punished by God for their excesses. As for the Christians, their main source of historical records were simply letters sent back and forth between clergymen and the Pope to update him on the Crusades. At the Battle of Dorylaeum during the First Crusade, Bohemond of Taranto ordered his troops to stand still for 8 hours in the baking sun in order to defeat Kilij Arslan. He crushed Kilij Arslan's forces. During another battle, Bohemond's men hadn't eaten for 2 weeks because they were besieged inside a fort they'd captured. None of them were in fighting order and they no longer had cavalry for the knights, so he asked the papal legate, Adhemar of Puy, what he should do. Adhemar of Puy spoke to God and said God told him that the men shouldn't eat for another week. The only way to fight the Muslims was to march his dying infantry straight out of the castle gates and use inferior infantry tactics against cavalry by running straight at them. It was guaranteed that they were going to lose. Again, they crushed the Muslims. The entirety of the First Crusade is insane and it's a miracle that the Christians won because they did absolutely nothing right. It's a perfect example of continually falling upwards.